A message from your scribe.
Overcrowding, traffic, air pollution, and finally the lack of affordable housing. These are issues that affect all major urban centers worldwide. However, many centuries ago in ancient Rome, these issues were also a pressing concern for its administrators and a nuisance for its residents. Ancient Rome, as the capital of one of the most powerful empires in human history, attracted people from various corners of the world. Overcrowding was an inherent side effect of the phenomenon of the Eternal City, leading to crowded streets, food and water supply problems, and other dangers, including fires and an increased risk of disease spread. The low availability of affordable housing was another challenge. The growth of the population did not always go hand in hand with access to suitable housing conditions, leading to the creation of impoverished neighborhoods where living conditions, let's not be afraid to say it, were deplorable. In this video, we will explore how the ancient Romans coped with the necessity of living in one of the most significant centers of civilization in ancient world. Just like today, the size and location of dwelling depended on one's wealth. The wealthiest and most famous figures of the Eternal City inhabited luxurious residences located on the Palatine Hill or its vicinity. The very name of the hill is not coincidentally associated with a palace, because through some languages it even made its way into English, serving as a reminder of the residences that once stood on the Roman hill. If we were to move ourselves several centuries into the past to stroll through the poorer neighborhoods of Rome, we would need to be cautious though. On the streets, except for those leading to the Roman Forum or the Capitol here or the Palatine, we wouldn't feel really safe. These cobblestone paved pathways were far from any modern standards, and calling these roads is quite an exaggeration. In these alleys, often not even two carts could pass each other, leading to frequent traffic jams. In the 1st century, due to this issue, zones were introduced where private cars were not allowed and vehicles could only move in them for business or supply purposes. As we can see, even this invention, which is eagerly being implemented in an increasing number of European cities today, has its roots long before anyone said the word car. Furthermore, one had to be wary of the omnipresent filth or even feces, as not every building was connected to a sewer system, or at least had a cesspit. Since the sewage was disposed of through a system of pipes directly into the Tiber River, it could also happen that after heavy rains the river returned to the residents everything they had discharged into it. It was necessary to watch out for a garbage not only underfoot, because they could also fall from above. The idea of a container filled with various kinds of waste falling from above may seem more associated with medieval times, but it did occur even in the cities of the empire. Rather unpleasant substances could land on an unsuspecting passerby's face, also in ancient Rome. In such cases, the injured party would turn to the district administrator, who acted as a judge, and after a detailed report concerning both physical and reputational damages, a fine was imposed on the perpetrator, along with an obligation to pay compensation to the injured party. The last threat was the sight of the setting sun. No citizen who valued their life would venture out after sunset because the dark pathways, especially in the poorer districts of Rome, were frequented by various robbers and bandits whom one would rather not encounter on their way. Doors were securely locked and citizens spent their evenings indoors, in homes which are the subject of this video. Multi-story buildings known as Insulae dominated the landscape of many cities in the empire, including its capital. The name itself literally means island. These buildings, which can be compared to today residential blocks, were typically not connected to neighboring structures, but rather surrounded by streets. This probably explained their name. Insulae began to appear in the 4th century BC, coinciding with the first sack of the city in the history. After nearly 7 months of siege, many buildings suffered damage or were completely destroyed due to fires or damage caused by the invaders. And although according to Livy the destruction was not complete, the rapid reconstruction of the city occurred with a complete disregard for city planning. Not only were the streets neglected, leading to a chaotic street layout with narrow and inconvenient roads, but also sewage systems, which were not extended to all newly emerging buildings. The insulae built in Rome were just too narrow for the engineering capabilities and, above all, the quality of materials used by the builders. Their surface area ranged from 300 to 400 square meters, so considering their height, sometimes exceeding 20 meters, they were often taller than they were wide. In the 1st century, Vitruvius did not yet see the danger in the growing buildings, although ironically he warned against their further expansion. He pointed out the thin exterior walls, which, surprisingly, according to Roman law, could not exceed 1.5 feet, which is 45 centimeters, a very small value considering the height of these buildings. However, the regulations were created for two-story buildings in mind, and insulae were often multi-story. If we add floors hastily woven together with thin wooden beams covered with a mixture of clay, rubble and sand, we have a ready recipe for the house of cards, or rather houses of cards, of which there were plenty in Rome. Insulae often buried their inhabitants, collapsing due to poor materials and construction imperfections. The instability of these buildings did not go unnoticed for poets, including Juvenal, who in his satires drew attention to the constant danger and fear experienced by the residents. He highlighted how these buildings, while providing shelter, could become the cause of the worst nightmare. We inhabit a Rome held up for the most part by slender props, since that's the way management stopped the buildings falling down. Once they've covered some ancient yawning crack, they'll tell us to sleep soundly at the edges of the ruin. On the ground floor of these buildings there were sometimes spacious apartments for the owners, but more commonly we would notice there some artisan workshops. The upper floors were designated for residential purposes. However, before we move on to them, we must first take a closer look at the ground floor, because even though it may seem like it contained nothing more than a storage room or a shop, often in its corners you could spot a narrow stairs or a ladder leading to small mezzanines. They were typically inhabited by either the tenants of the shop itself or even more commonly by its employees. These mezzanines had only one windowed room, which didn't offer much space. When the tenants of these mezzanines were unable to pay the rent, the owner would simply take away their ladder. On the higher floors there were proper residential units called coenacula. External staircases led to these units. The apartments themselves were divided into 2 or 3 rooms. In a coenaculum you would find a bedroom, a living room and so-called middle room, which was a common space for all residents of the insula and likely served as the kitchen area. These apartments lacked the most basic amenities such as running water or central heating, which could often be found in private residences or public buildings. All these apartments were rented to tenants as follows. The owners, which is probably not surprising, were mostly patricians. However, not wanting to personally deal with the search for new tenants, they leased the entire property to one person at a fixed rate, which was 3/4 of the actual rental value. It was the responsibility of these administrators to find new tenants and collect rent from them. But that's not all. The property had to be maintained and repaired basically all the time, and this was a full-time job, but these administrators prospered and drove up rental fees, especially when the patrician owner was unaware of current rental values. The residents of specific apartments often sublet individual rooms to other people to minimize the constantly increasing rent. The higher the floor, the higher the population density, as renting apartments on higher level gradually became cheaper. Tenants of the top floor were probably in the worst position not only because of the heat in the summer, but also because they were risking their lives in exchange for the opportunity of inexpensive housing. To fully understand what insulae really were, let's take a closer look at their evolution. After the mentioned sack of the city, the organic development of it was disrupted for the first time in its history. By the decision of the Senate, Rome was enclosed by the so-called Servian Wall. Regardless of the social status, all residents wanted to locate their houses within these fortifications. Instead of building new homes outside the walls, residents chose to add more floors to increasingly taller tenement buildings. Just 150 years later, at the end of the 3rd century, Livy in his work Ab Urbe Condita mentions an omen that was supposed to herald the incoming Carthage offensive. The omen was a bull that had climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor of one of the thousands of insulae that had become common for the residents of Rome during this period. Next centuries brought further growth to these buildings. However, it took hundreds of years and the arrival of the Roman Empire for someone to finally address the problem of the sprawling, haphazardly constructed rental properties. While Augustus and Trajan legally limited the height of these buildings to 20 and 18 meters respectively, the need was greater than the law's strength. Consequently, these regulations were not respected, and the tallest buildings reached even the 8 stories. Their numbers also continued to grow. By the mid-4th century, their count exceeded 45,000, when one must consider that Rome had already been invaded multiple times by barbarians and ravaged by fires, including the Great Fire that occurred during Nero's reign. By the way, fires were perhaps one of the greatest threats to these buildings because although the lower floors were typically constructed from stone or brick, the upper stories were hastily assembled from lower quality wood or even rubble. Although the buildings constructed in Rome were often built hastily and from inferior materials, their owners still cared about their durability and relative longevity. The situation was quite different for buildings that had to be reconstructed after fires. Fires were indeed common, and they especially started on the upper floors, where the flames from the fireplaces or oil lamps would directly affect wooden walls. Fires were frequent and devastating, and there was no state fire department in Rome until the 1st century. The market loophole was filled by Marcus Licinius Crassus, who created his own organization, which was a combination of fire brigade and a rather aggressive insurance company. Plutarch, among others, examined his activities, providing us with an account of the business idea that this Roman politician had come up with. Observing how natural and familiar at Rome were such fatalities as the conflagration and collapse of buildings, owing to their being too massive and close together, he proceeded to buy slaves, who were architects and builders. Then, when he had over 500 of these, he would buy houses that were afire, and houses which adjoined those that were afire, and these their owners would let go at a low price, owing to their fear and uncertainty. In this way, the largest part of Rome came into his possession. So to sum up everything, Crassus trained 500 men divided into firefighting, demolition and construction brigades. He would then wait for fires to occur, which were quite frequent in the city. When a fire broke out, he and his group would go to the scene and then at significantly reduced price he would acquire the burning building. His people would either extinguish the fire in the insula or secure its remains, after which they would build an even shoddier structure on its ruins. When its dubious renovation was completed, sometimes the owner was offered the option to repurchase it, but more often, only the lease of the entire building was offered. In this rather non-ethical way, Crassus became the owner of many properties in Rome, but he can also be seen as one of the first enthusiasts of passive income. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel.